Bye.
Well, Uncle Dan.
Yes, sir.
We are, again, delving into the realm of the how-to.
Yeah. This one's a good one. Now you, Uncle Mark, are a member of the LGBTQI community.
I am.
I am not in
Yes.
any appreciable way.
Yet we tolerate you.
Thank you. I appreciate that. But we've invited someone else on to help us talk about one of those letters.
That's right. And
We're going to talk about the T in all of that.
Exactly. So this is, when you're coming out of religion.
We're going to have a tea party.
We're going to have a tea party. When you come out of religion, you are oftentimes, as forward-thinking and well-meaning as you want to be, you may still be burdened with some programming. Right. You may still be burdened with things like misogyny, racism, homophobia, transphobia. And this is a long conversation, this series of how-tos we're going to do about those issues and how to talk about and think about and understand them as a well-meaning person wanting to engage with that world. And
It's how to be cool.
It's how to be cool. And we have a McCool person here with us.
Yes,
we have
indeed.
Our friend, Marissa Alexa McCool, from the Inciting Incident podcast, to help us talk about trans issues, trans definitions, etc.
Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Of course.
Yeah.
So good to have you here. And I think this is an incredibly important conversation for all of us, whether we're newly out of religion or a long time out.
Yes, indeed. Marissa, I'm gonna date myself quite a bit here and say that one of my first intros into the world of trans people was a little lecture that I went to at the Salt Lake City Pride Center by a woman who talked to us about what trannies are.
Oh my God!
So that's how old I am and how far back I go with this stuff. But a lot of people know nothing more than the last name Jenner.
Yes.
When it comes to trans issues. And we brought you on here to help us through some of the basics. We're not gonna go deep dive in here, but we need to get at least a functional understanding of what we're talking about.
Yeah,
Sure. A little trans 101, if you will.
Let's do it. I'm excited about it.
Yeah, me too.
Maybe we can start. I don't know if you think this is the best place to start, but let's talk a little bit about sex and gender and what it all means.
Sure. So one way to put it is we are assigned a gender at birth. And for all the people who are so quick to tell us what our biological, chromosomal, whatever argument they're using to somehow tell us we aren't who we are, we're not talking about that. We're talking you come out of your mother and someone says, okay, you're a boy or you're a girl.
Now they have a sorting hat for that. Is that right? Is this how...
I think it's baked into a cake. Isn't that how it works now? I'm not sure. But, that's the basic version of it. And then, of course, even that excludes intersex people who are born sometimes with both or, that's another conversation altogether. But there are those of us who are told who and what we are when we are born, and we just never fit into those definitions, into those expectations, into those societal norms that
Sorry to interrupt you. I didn't mean to interrupt you. But there's this sense when we talk about the assignment of birth, I mean, we're talking about sort of well-meaning doctors and parents looking down, seeing a vagina or a penis, and saying boy or girl. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
And for the purposes of this conversation, that is what we will call sex. Is that correct?
Sure.
Okay.
So go on. So there you are. Someone has seen a penis, and they've said boy, and then that person is then sort of there are expectations, and there are
roles assigned, and etc.
Of course, and it goes the other way too. Of course,
right.
One of the biggest myths that you can start with right away is that people think trans is only about trans women, because that's the most stigmatized and the most the biggest punchline, shall we say, in plenty of comedies.
Oh, right.
But trans men exist too. I married one, so
Right.
I feel like that's important to point out as well. So, I mean, I'm 32, so I grew up in the 90s when gay visibility was really starting to gain traction, but it was gaining traction in a tokenizing, almost mocking way.
Right.
Just think the character Big Gay Al, and that was the 90s. Like that's how gay people were. They were super over the top and flamboyant,
Yeah.
and how are you? Kiss, kiss. Every token gay best friend in a movie.
Right.
And a lot of people tried to push me into that box, which I suppose is a lot better than some other people have had to deal with, because my parents tried to set me up with like mentors, their gay friends who could help me through that. And I just kept going, I know I'm different, but not like that.
Interesting.
Yeah. It wasn't that tune.
Right.
Right.
But as a little girl, that's how I refer to myself as the correct gender, even in the past.
Mm-hmm.
I just always wanted to be around women, was never really interested in any of the things that boys did. I didn't understand them, and I still don't. And, I liked when they would put makeup on me or offer me their clothes or anything like that. And I always just felt more emotionally connected to how that looked. But of course, that was a one-way ticket to getting beaten up in school every day. So you had to moderate it and overcompensate in other places.
Sure. So
But,
what we're
yeah.
talking about here, Marissa, in case it's mysterious to anyone, is that you are a trans woman.
That's correct.
Right. And then that gets to, I guess, the follow-on definition to the sex is then, would it then be gender?
Yes.
So how do we define sex versus gender?
Okay. So I was asked this question at Skepticon by a 9-year-old girl, and I figure if I can explain it to her in a way that makes sense, pretty much anyone can get it.
Right.
Well, I mean, and that's good, because Uncle Mark and I are not necessarily much more advanced than that 9-year-old girl.
Maybe
so.
not, yeah.
So most people conflate being trans with being gay, right or wrong. And there can, of course, be gay trans people, once again, down the line. Anyway, so the girl's father came up to me and said, my daughter is having a hard time understanding the sexuality that is transgender. And I said, well, first we have to stop right there. Sexuality, orientation, that's who you're attracted to.
Right.
That's external. Gender is your identity. That's internal. Who I'm attracted to has nothing to do with who I am.
Right.
So I am a trans woman because I'm a woman, not because I'm attracted to other people.
Right. So, yes, I think that that's an important distinction. And there can be trans people who are straight, meaning attracted, like for a woman such as yourself, attracted to men, I guess, and trans people who are gay, meaning a trans woman who's attracted to a man, or a trans man, or to another woman, or trans man who's attracted to another man.
Right.
Am I on the right track? I'm on the hunt here?
You are.
Okay.
I think that's a very good explanation to say it's the difference between internal and external.
Right.
Right. So gender basically being gender identity being this is the gender I truly am.
This is who you are.
Right.
Not and doesn't tell you anything about to whom you are attracted.
Right. And then attraction is separate from that, exactly.
Right. It's checking a different box. When you fill out your taxes, for instance, when it says, marital status, you don't put male.
Right.
You put married, single, whatever. That's what it's like when someone says, why can't you just be gay? And I get that at least once every 2 weeks or so. It's like, because, well, I am, just not the way you think.
Right.
Right.
And that's another thing, is that yeah. I mean, it's important to keep attraction separate from identity.
Yes.
Except in Mark's case, because Mark is only identifies as by who he's attracted to. That's just a weird feature of Mark.
Yeah. Oh, I'm a hot mess.
So that explains all those Eli Bosnick tweets.
That's
Yep.
right.
I don't think anything can explain anything.
So
about
what do you
Mark.
think is the next, Marissa, what do you think is the next important definition for people to understand properly?
Well, there's a couple I'm going to put in together here just to sort of help people distinguish between certain parts of the process. When a person decides that they want to live as their true gender, they go through a transition. A lot of people think the transition begins with genital surgery. And one of the important things that as a trans activist and someone who does a lot of Trans 101 points out, someone doesn't have to get surgery to be who they are.
Right.
It's not like I live as one, the person that everybody thought I was until I get my shiny new science vagina. That's not the way it works.
Right.
You have to
Do
transition.
they shine those? I didn't know that those were shined.
Oh my God! I think you just
Well, you
named
see,
the episode.
Well, they burn off the hair so that you don't regrow hair inside your vagina because that would be painful. So, they do shine it up because you never have to shave again.
Well, that sounds nice.
That brings up some really interesting points. First of all, and I certainly am this knowledgeable, when a person consciously decides they're going to begin transitioning to their true identity, their true self, that begins, even if there is going to be a surgical alteration, that transition begins long before there is any kind of intervention of that kind, correct?
Yes.
Right.
There is the social transition, which is where someone comes out and says, I know you've known me as X. I want you to call me this name and use these pronouns from now on. Sometimes it's a binary transition, which means, like me, I am a binary female, but other people transition into non-binary identities and use pronouns like they, like my co-host on my second podcast, Ari Stillman, or my partner, Devin. So that's the social transition, and a lot of things that go into that are things like legal name changes, getting the gender marker on your ID changed, getting your birth certificate changed. There's also the hormonal transition, which is where you might hear this referred to as HRT, which is short for hormone replacement therapy.
Right.
And that is where I'll use myself as an example. As a trans woman, I take estrogen and also a testosterone blocker called spironolactone. And that's generally what trans women take, at least until they have either a bottom surgery or an orchiectomy, because then they aren't producing it anymore anyway. So
orchiectomy is when the balls come off.
That's correct.
Okay.
Right. And then testosterone is no longer, suppressing testosterone is no longer needed.
Right. That's correct. So from there, like I said, I also take a supplement called progesterone, which is a form of birth control that trans women use. It's a birth control pill, but they use it to sort of simulate the menstrual cycle, and it also helps make our boobs bigger. So that's kind of the added benefit there.
Right. So that's all of that is covered under the umbrella of the actual the transition.
The hormonal transition, yes.
But we should be clear. I mean, you alluded to this, Marissa, but we should be clear that a person's identity, their gender identity, nobody's under any requirement to make physical changes to their body.
That's correct.
To have that. So I have a trans friend who is a trans woman who has some medical conditions that prevent her from doing a lot of the hormonal stuff and stuff. She presents.
I think I know what you're talking about.
She presents fairly masculine to a lot of people, to a lot of people's eye, and yet we still we as well as good people who care about the feelings of others still are under obligation to call her. And to honor her. She has transitioned, just not in any sort of physical way.
Right. And I think I know who you're talking about. Are her initials DM?
Well, I'm sure.
Okay. She's a friend of mine, too. That's why I was just curious.
Right.
But anyway, yes, you are correct. Because the baseline assumption when people try to correct you, whether you can, quote unquote, pass as cis or not, is when they say, no, you're X. They are saying, I know who you are better than you do. And that's a shitty thing to say.
It's a super shitty thing to say.
To anybody for any reason, really.
Yeah. Yes. And we don't have to get, unless you guys want to, we don't have to get lost in the pronoun thing because I think we're doing really well with the definitions. Except I will say this. To me, it's exactly the same. If somebody tells you their name, if you said, I'm Dan, and I said, no, you're more like a Joe to me.
Yeah.
Right. It's absurd.
It's just a dick move.
And what's a dick move? And it doesn't make any fucking sense. When someone tells you, this is my pronoun, I can't for the life of me understand why you don't respect that person enough to honor that.
Well, and this is kind of the basis of my activism, which is, once again, doing a lot of Trans 101, but it's also exploring the fact that until about 3 years ago, trans women especially only existed as one of two things in popular culture: a punchline or a serial killer. The primary example I point to is Ace Ventura, where they have a trans woman and then they misgender her the whole time. And then when they find out that she's a quote unquote man, they have to burn all their clothes, vomit, and take a plunger to their face. So that's typical.
Although
when you have that kind of pop culture representation until like 2014 exclusively,
right,
it of course is going to influence how people think about it, not just from the religious perspective, but just from a cultural perspective in general.
Sure. Although I do have to say, I think that there is something to the notion that someone who purposefully misgenders other people and reacts so disgustingly to the revelation that someone is trans, a plunger to the face sounds like an appropriate thing to me.
Exactly. You know, I don't. I'm much older than you guys. I don't know if you remember a thriller called To Live and Die in L.A., where it was an action movie, a cop movie, and the bad person was a trans woman who was also who was a killer and some kind of insane kung fu master that nearly killed the cop in a bathroom. And that was a pop culture reference. You know, of course, she was just generally a devil, right?
Yep. Buffalo Bill, Norman Bates.
Right.
There are so many representations of us that either find us as sick freaks that are punchlines, or people who are going to kill themselves or kill other people to assume their identity. And that's a lot of the stigma that we have to fight against.
Now, Marissa, I need you to be honest with us. Have you killed anyone?
Not that you know of. I do have a dead name, so that's just
boom. You killed a former identity is what you did.
Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, talk about dead naming and that whole concept.
Okay. Dead naming is when you know a person prior to their transition and you decide to keep calling them that name after they have asked you to call them something else. So I used to have a name. You don't need to know what it is. My name is Marissa.
Yeah.
But if you've known me long enough to know what that name was, if you called me that name, you would be dead naming me. And that's a really difficult thing, especially for the people who cannot, quote unquote, pass by standards of people who are not trans. And Once again, that's another discussion. But essentially, when people do that, a lot of the times they just think, oh, I just made a mistake. Don't take it so seriously. I didn't mean it. And it's like, well, first of all, it's not up to you to tell me how to take it. It's not up to you to tell me how to feel. But even if I allow you that space, that you made a mistake, you still called me something that I am trying to put in the past, make it go away. That is not who I am. That is who you thought I am. This is who I am. So I will allow you that space, a certain amount of time, to get used to calling me a new name and using a new pronoun. But you also have to respect that it's going to hurt if you get it wrong.
Right.
And there's only so long you can take that before you start to think that it's either habitual or that they're just not putting in the effort, whether or not you get it.
Right.
You don't have to get it. It's just when someone asks you to call them something, just call them that. It's really not that difficult.
It's a tiny little violence, I think, when anyone refers to someone in a way that isn't that they don't identify. Mm-hmm. And it may be inadvertent, and I think that it's nice for you to mention that maybe some space can be left open for mistakes. If it's an honest mistake, because I can tell you, I've had multiple friends who have transitioned, and I have fucked up on the gender identifiers every now and then, or I've messed up a name. I've dead named somebody by accident, just because I knew them for X many years before the transition, and that's just where my brain puts them.
Right, but that's different than an act of cruelty.
Correct.
Yes.
That's different than "fuck you, this is your name." Right.
Yes.
And I try to be cruel in entirely different ways.
Sure, more fun ways, I'm sure.
Right.
But,
Tell her her shoes are stupid.
Exactly.
like when it came to my parents or my grandparents, for instance, of course you're going to have to allow a certain amount of time because it's been 30 years that they've known you by this name.
Right.
And that takes effort. And I completely understand that. There is a window where it's still going to hurt, but of course it's going to take time. When it's other people, you give them less rope, especially because I'm not a firebrand. I'm not somebody who's going to go out and scream at you unless you come at me from a point of malice. But most of us who do this kind of activism can tell the difference between someone who is malicious and someone who is ignorant.
Right.
Well-meaning or not, we can usually distinguish that.
Sure, because, as as a person who's queer or other, and you've lived either secretly or out in the open all your life, every little cue. Every little look.
Oh, yeah.
And every little glance and every sneer. Like I totally, the cues may be subtle to other people, but to queer people, they're not so subtle.
They're really not, especially because we're in such a state of hypervigilance,
Right.
Especially with the kind of violence going on. I mean, we still have a Trans Day of Remembrance, and the list grows every year, unfortunately.
Ugh.
So sometimes people just say, oh, you can't live like that. You can't live always in fear. It's like, well, you're not being murdered for who you are, so maybe step back a little bit and not tell me how to feel.
Indeed.
Why do we have to keep persecuting Christians like this, Marissa?
I don't know.
Just lay off. Everybody be nice. I do want to say, or to get to one thing, Marissa, which is, let us say that one of our well-meaning, good listeners out there does mess up and actually, misgenders or dead names someone. What's the protocol? What would be the best way to make that right?
Well, it's different for every person. I don't want to say that there's one way to do it because some people want you to go through a different process than others. Generally, with me, I just want you to say you're sorry, correct yourself, and move on. Like for instance, my boss accidentally let a wayward sir go the other day, and he's known me as nothing else. So, he immediately corrected himself and was like, sorry. Like, that's enough.
Right.
Just clarify, say the right thing, put a sorry in there and move on. But saying things like, oh, I didn't mean it, you should, don't dictate how people feel, especially if you don't have that experience. Let them feel what they do, but correct yourself and apologize. Those are two things that are usually enough.
Indeed. I'm going to tell a story about myself, reveal that I am not always the brilliant and socially perfect human that I know my listeners have come to believe that I am. And I'm going to tell a story about a person, an acquaintance of mine. Now, this was a person who made my coffee frequently, a barista, and I used to go to this coffee shop fairly regularly, and knew this particular barista initially as a woman, and she would make my coffee for me, and then I noticed that the way this person dressed got more butch. And got more masculine, and I just assumed lesbian, which I'm, I'll get to the purpose of me telling this story. I promise I'm not just bragging here.
Bragging.
But I sort of was watching this. I mean, a transition was taking place. I didn't know what it was. It struck me as just a sort of fashion transition, and then suddenly, this person had some facial hair, and I realized, oh shit, I'm witnessing a probable gender transition, and yet I still at one point misgendered her, him, and said her, and then realized that I hadn't even established enough of a relationship to say anything about this person's gender. It was a very awkward moment for me. And I wonder if, why am I telling this story?
Well, I think you're telling the story.
I'm an idiot.
Okay.
I think what I'm trying to illustrate is that that this can be a tricky thing for us for people to understand, because we're so used to genderizing being an important part of our social
and the outward signals of that. And
right.
So I think the best way to preface this next part, or for you to help us through this next part, Marissa, is, the only people that are listening to this show I really think, are well-meaning and don't want to fuck up and want to be supportive and inclusive. So the haters aren't listening, so fuck them. Let's not worry about them because they're just going to be who they are. But
heck the cis.
right, and for those who really, really want to honor people where they're at and be decent fucking people about it, in moments like Dan's just describing, how do we navigate that?
Yeah, can you
Fix everything for us, Marissa.
There's a better way than whatever I did. Why don't you? Do you have any advice for someone who is part on a journey like that?
Sure. The best thing to do is ask, and if you don't feel comfortable directly asking, ask someone they know. And another good way to approach it is to use gender-neutral language until they tell you, or until they are willing to let you, if they're willing to let you know. Because like I just did, I just used a gender-neutral pronoun right there. Mm-hmm. So if we were talking about a hypothetical person, I could use that kind of language until I know for sure. Because I would rather go with gender-neutral language than risk misgendering somebody, because that shit hurts. So,
yeah, right.
So if you're not,
can you word that question for me though?
Yeah, I'm dying to know what would be the way to word that question, because I don't know.
Well, first of all, don't ask, are you a boy or a girl? That is one of the shittiest things you can say to a person. But say, what should I call you? What is your name? How should I refer to you? And once again, if you're not comfortable doing that to them, go up to someone they know. Go to one of their friends. Go to one of their coworkers and say, I don't want to disrespect this person. How should I refer to them? And really, most people who know a trans person are more than willing to tell you, because they don't want to see their friend get hurt.
Right.
So the best thing to do is not have a leading a question that leads. So you don't want to say, is that a guy? But just say, how should I refer to this person? Because then it gives them the chance to tell you, rather than immediately being defensive and having to correct you. And that's better on the awkwardness levels on both parties.
Right. Because I think what can happen with well-meaning people is they may be so, they don't have language, they probably don't understand a lot of the definitions that we've kind of gone over, and what sucks is kind of a paralysis, right? Where maybe you want to make a friend or you want to have a conversation. Now it's not on that person to have the conversation if they don't want it, but you want to have some kind of introduction, but maybe there's just such a paralysis that you don't know how to approach.
Well, and I think one of the ways to think about this is that there are people who may not dress or present in a way that is easily identifiable in in any gender, and but you may. So there's no reason why you shouldn't be able to just say, "How should I refer to you?" or hopefully people who are trans or who present non-gender in a non-gendered way are going to be okay. Are going to appreciate an effort to get it right. Would you say that that's true?
I absolutely would, because a trans person, I once again, not 100%. I don't want to give a blanket platitude, but most trans people would rather you ask and be able to give you the correct information than have the wrong answer assumed.
Okay.
Yeah, it's funny how the onus is always on the minority person, on the minority position, right? The onus is always on the person who's already, in a crosshairs to be the educator, to be the, to be open-hearted, to be generous with people. And it's silly, but it's just kind of the way the world works, isn't it?
But the least the rest of us can do is at least make the effort to get things correct.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just treat people with respect. A great example, most people who went to school would be there on the first day. And, the teacher would call roll and they would say, Jennifer. And she would say, do you want me to call you anything? I would prefer Jen. Nobody would go, fuck you, Jennifer. That's what's on your birth certificate. That's what I'm going to call you.
Right.
It's the same thing. Just it might be a slightly different name than what you're expecting.
As difficult as this, as difficult as I'm sure a lot of trans people find themselves in life and contemporary. We'll just stick with America for a second. Do you feel like you were talking about the media landscape of the 90s? Do you feel like the culture has moved in a positive direction rapidly in the same way that it has with the marriage equality argument?
Yes, I do.
Yeah.
And the part of that is the fact that people who still hold and argue for some of those bad and harmful perspectives and opinions are now being called out on them. And, if any of you watched Dave Chappelle's newest stand-up special, it wasn't particularly friendly to us. And that gives trans people the reputation sometimes of not being able to take a joke. And it's like, no, we can take a joke when the joke isn't how weird this person is because they're trans. That's an important distinction to make. So, there can be plenty of jokes at trans people's expense. There can be plenty of stories without us being one of those two things that I alluded to before. But when the joke is that we're trans, it's not okay.
Right. Sure, it's a slur.
A trans person can be weird for any number of other reasons, and we can totally make fun of those things.
Right.
It's just not about whether them being trans as a thing.
Right. Like, I'm a lesbian married to a man. It's weird, or, I date a girl named Nella. Like, it's just, there are plenty of material. It's just funny when people think that the only way that comedy can happen is by reinforcing marginalized stereotypes, at which case you're just saying, I don't want to put in the effort to have to think about it.
Right. It's the old punching down thing. It's saying fag. It's using a marginalized group to just make an easy, stupid, cheap joke about it.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Well, Marissa Alexa McCool, thank you so much for coming on. Where can our listeners find you if they want to learn more?
Well, since my shiny new science vagina will be coming up soon, you can find me through my partners, Aiden, Devin, and Nella. But other than that, RissaMcCool.com is where my sort of 101 is. You can find my books there. I have 5 books, fiction and non. And my podcasts, the primary one is the Inciting Incident podcast, which you guys were on episode number 119.
Yep.
The secondary show, which if you want to learn some Trans 101 from some people who are trans, and it's our trans exclusive show. All guests and all people who participate in the show are trans. It's called The Cis Are Getting Out of Hand. Don't let the name scare you away. What we do with that show is generally put an issue into a skit and act it out, because it's usually a lot easier to grasp an idea if you see it play out rather than just talking about it.
Oh, smart. Very smart.
That's very interesting. That would be great.
We'll post that in the show notes, and I'll give that a listen for sure.
Yeah. And thanks a lot for coming on.
Absolutely. It's a blast.
Thanks, Marissa. We'll talk to you again soon.